The moment Maggie Lawson stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1878, she made herself a promise that she intended to keep for the rest of her natural life. She would never, under any circumstances, trust a cowboy again. The town itself was exactly what she had expected. Dusty Creek sat in a wide valley between two rust-colored ridges, the kind of place where the wind never quite stopped blowing, and the sun beat down on everything without mercy or manners. A single main street ran through the heart of it, lined with a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop, a small church with a crooked steeple, and the Copper Kettle Saloon, which appeared to be doing the most business of any establishment at that particular hour of the afternoon. A wooden sign above the sheriff's office had been half torn away by some past storm, and nobody had bothered to fix it. The whole town had a feeling of impermanence to it, like it had been built in a hurry and might be abandoned in even less time. Maggie was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned back beneath a practical bonnet and green eyes that had learned, through considerable and painful experience, how to look at the world with clear-eyed suspicion. She carried a single large trunk, a carpet-bag, and the deed to the 40-acre plot of land she had inherited from her late uncle, Gerald Lawson, who had died the previous winter of a fever that swept through this part of the territory with indiscriminate cruelty. Gerald had been the only member of her family she had truly liked, and now he was gone, and all she had left of him was 40 acres of Colorado dirt and the instructions in his last letter to her, which read, "Come west, Maggie girl. This land will be good to you if you give it a chance. Do not let anyone talk you out of it." She had not told anyone in Abilene, Kansas, where she had been working as a seamstress and taking in laundry for the past 3 years, that the reason she was leaving had less to do with her uncle's land, and more to do with a man named Dale Crocker. Dale Crocker had been a cowboy, a cattle drover who worked the long trail north, and who had spent 8 months courting Maggie with hat-in-hand sweetness and honeyed words that turned out to be worth precisely nothing. He had taken from her what he could take, made promises he never intended to keep, and ridden south again when the next drive came through, leaving behind nothing but a broken engagement, a ruined reputation, and the kind of hurt that settles into a person's chest like a stone you cannot dig out no matter how hard you try. Maggie had done her grieving and her fuming, and then she had packed everything she owned into a trunk and bought a stagecoach ticket. She was done with Abilene, done with the pitying looks from the women at the church social, done with the whispers, and done, permanently and without exception, with cowboys. She walked the length of the main street of Dusty Creek with her chin up, found the land office without any trouble, and sat across from a thin, nervous man named Mr. Pullman who wore spectacles on the very tip of his nose and kept adjusting them as he studied the deed she placed on his desk. "Everything looks in order, Miss Lawson," he said at last. "Your uncle's property is about 4 miles east of town. Good land, actually. Creek runs through the south edge of it. Only thing is, it hasn't been worked in a while. Gerald was sick most of last year and couldn't keep it up. You'll have some clearing to do, and you'll need help." "I am aware I will need help," Maggie said. "I am not afraid of work." Mr. Pullman looked at her over his spectacles the way people looked at someone they thought was underestimating a situation. "Yes, ma'am. I don't doubt that. Only there's one other matter." He hesitated, straightening a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "The land bordering yours to the north belongs to a man named Harlan Price. He's been expressing an interest in acquiring your uncle's property, has been for some time. He approached Gerald about it before he passed, and Gerald turned him down flat. I expect he'll approach you." "And if he does," Maggie said calmly, "I will turn him down the same way." Mr. Pullman nodded, though he still looked worried. "Just thought you ought to know." Maggie took the deed back, tucked it into her carpet-bag, and thanked him politely. She had enough money saved to last her a few months if she was careful, and she had plans, real plans, not the kind that depended on anyone else doing the right thing. She would grow a kitchen garden first, then perhaps keep chickens. And if the creek ran clean and reliable, she might be able to do some washing on contract for the town. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. She had arranged, through a letter sent ahead of her arrival, to board at the home of a widow named Mrs. Clara Hutchins, who lived on the south end of town and rented out a back room for $3 a month. Mrs. Hutchins turned out to be a comfortable, round-faced woman of about 50 who smelled of cinnamon and had opinions about everything, which she shared freely and without invitation. Maggie liked her almost immediately. "You'll want to go out and see the land tomorrow morning, Mrs. Hutchins said over supper that first evening, ladling out a thick bean soup with the authority of a woman who had fed many boarders and tolerated no complaints. "I'll pack you a lunch, and you'll want to ask Jedediah Barnett about the fencing on your east boundary. He rides that way most mornings and he'd know the condition of it better than anybody." "Who is Jedediah Barnett?" Maggie asked. "Rancher. Has a spread about 2 miles north of yours, runs about 300 head. Good man." Mrs. Hutchins paused. "A little closed off, maybe. Lost his father 2 years back and took it hard. But honest as the day is long, and he knows this land better than his own hands." "Is he a cowboy?" Maggie asked, keeping her voice perfectly neutral. Mrs. Hutchins looked at her with the particular alertness of a woman who understood that a question like that came from somewhere specific. "He's a rancher," she said carefully. "He works cattle, so yes, I suppose you'd call him a cowboy." "Why?" "No reason," Maggie said, and changed the subject. She rode out to her land the following morning on a borrowed horse, a steady, elderly bay gelding that Mrs. Hutchins kept in a small paddock behind the house, and who moved at a pace that suggested he had long ago made peace with the futility of hurry. The morning was cool and smelled of sage, and the sky was that particular shade of deep Colorado blue that looked almost too vivid to be real, as though God had put a little extra effort into the color out here on account of there being so much of it. The land her uncle had left her was rough but beautiful in the way that most of Colorado was beautiful unapologetically, and without any interest in making things easy for the people who tried to live on it. The grass was long and tangled in places. The fence line along the road was leaning badly in several spots, and the small cabin Gerald had built needed new chinking between the logs and a shutter repaired. But the creek at the south edge ran cold and clear, exactly as Gerald had described in his letters, and the soil near the water was dark and rich. A stand of cottonwood trees grew along the bank, their leaves trembling in the morning breeze with a sound like very quiet applause. Maggie stood at the water's edge for a long time, feeling something she had not expected to feel, which was hope. Real hope, the kind that doesn't come with conditions attached. She was walking the fence line along the east boundary, making notes in a small leather-bound book about which posts needed replacing and which sections of wire were damaged, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching from the north. She looked up. The man who rode toward her on a tall buckskin horse was somewhere in his late 20s. She would later learn he was 28, with a lean, weathered face and dark brown eyes that looked like they spent most of their time squinting into distances. He wore a battered, wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather, a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and working denims with worn leather chaps over them. He was not what she would have called immediately handsome, but he had the kind of face that held your attention the more you looked at it, a face with character to it, with history written in the fine lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He pulled up his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who chose his words with some care. "You must be Gerald Lawson's niece." "Maggie Lawson," she said, holding her ground in her notebook. "And you are?" "Jedediah Barnett. My spread is just north of yours." He looked past her at the fence line she had been studying. "That east boundary is in poor shape. Gerald knew it, but he didn't have the strength to fix it before he passed. I was going to mention it to whoever took over the property." "I have noted it already," Maggie said, holding up her book. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "Good. There was a brief silence in which the creek murmured behind her and a meadowlark called from somewhere in the long grass. "Gerald was a good man," Jedediah said. "I'm sorry for your loss." The sincerity in his voice was so plain and unadorned that it caught her slightly off guard. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "If you need anything while you're getting settled, my ranch is about 2 miles straight north. You can see the windmill from the ridge." He gathered his reins. "Welcome to Dusty Creek, Miss Lawson." He turned the buckskin and rode back the way he had come, easy in the saddle in the way that men who had spent most of their lives on horseback moved, as though horse and rider were a single creature that had reached a long-standing agreement about how things ought to go. Maggie watched him ride away, then turned back to her fence line. She told herself she was not going to think about Jedediah Barnett in any particular way. She had a fence to assess, a cabin to repair, and a life to build, and she was going to do all of those things without the involvement or interference of any cowboy, however plain-spoken and apparently decent he might appear to be. She lasted about 2 weeks before circumstances made avoiding him genuinely impractical. The trouble started with Harlan Price. Price was a big man with a thick red mustache and the self-assured manner of someone who had gotten most of what he wanted for most of his life, and had never developed a particularly gracious relationship with the word no. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, over 1,000 head, by general estimate, and he had been trying to expand his holdings in every direction for the better part of 5 years. He had acquired 3 neighboring properties in that time, all through means that the people who talked about it in lowered voices described as pressure, which was a polite word for something that wasn't polite at all. He arrived at Maggie's property on a Tuesday morning with 2 of his ranch hands riding behind him. Pulling up his horse in front of the cabin, she had been working to repair and waiting with the patient confidence of a man who expects to be attended to. Maggie came out the front door with a hammer in her hand because she had been in the middle of fixing the shutter and had heard the horses from inside. "Miss Lawson," Price said, touching his hat with the performative courtesy of a man who used manners the way a gambler uses a marked deck. "I'm Harlan Price. I own the land to your north." "I know who you are, Mr. Price," Maggie said. "Mr. Pullman at the land office mentioned you." Price smiled. "Then he probably told you I've been interested in this property. I'll get right to it, since I can see you're a practical woman. I'll offer you $800 for the 40 acres. That's a fair price, more than fair given the condition it's in. You could take that money back to wherever you came from and start fresh." Maggie looked at him steadily. "I'm already starting fresh," she said. "Right here, the land is not for sale." Price's smile remained in place, but something behind his eyes went flat. "You're new to this country, Miss Lawson. It's hard land for a woman alone." "Most land is hard," Maggie said. "I'm still not selling." He looked at the hammer in her hand, then back at her face, and seemed to make a calculation. "Well," he said pleasantly, "you think on it. Offer stands." He turned his horse and his 2 men followed, and they rode north without looking back. Maggie went back inside and stood very still for a moment with the hammer against her chest, making sure her hands were steady before she went back to work on the shutter. She did not tell anyone about the visit. She did not think it would amount to anything she couldn't handle. She had handled Dale Crocker and the gossips of Abilene, and 3 years of scrubbing other people's laundry until her hands bled in the winter cold, and she had handled all of that alone, and she was not about to go looking for someone to lean on. But 2 days later, one of her fence sections was knocked down, the section along the boundary nearest Price's land. She could not prove who had done it, and it might have been cattle, though she did not see any cattle nearby, and the break looked deliberate. She repaired it herself, driving new posts into the hard ground with a force that was largely fueled by a very specific kind of anger. And 3 days after that, her creek was muddy and disrupted in a way that suggested something upstream had disturbed it. And when she walked north along the bank, she found that a section of the bank had been deliberately broken open, rerouting some of the water flow into the adjacent pasture, which was Price's pasture. She stood there in the mud with her skirt hem dirty and her temper at a full boil, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She thought about going to the sheriff, whose name was Amos Tate and who was, according to Mrs. Hutchins, a good man but a careful one who was not inclined toward conflict with Harlan Price, who employed a significant portion of the county's working men. She was still thinking when she heard boots behind her on the creek bank and turned to find Jedediah Barnett standing there, hat in hand, looking at the broken bank with the expression of someone who has understood a situation immediately and doesn't like what he understands. "I was checking my south fence line," he said. "Saw the water running sideways. When did this happen?" "Sometime last night, I think," Maggie said. "This isn't cattle damage," he said. His voice was quiet and level, but there was something underneath it that suggested considerable restraint. "No," Maggie agreed. "It is not." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said the name because they both already knew it. "I can help you fix this," Jedediah said. "I've got a shovel on my horse and I know how this bank ought to lay." Maggie's first instinct was to say she could manage it herself because that was always her first instinct. But the bank was a significant job, and she could see from the way the ground had been worked that it would take most of the morning just for her to get it partially restored, and she had 12 other things that needed doing today. "I would appreciate the help," she said, which cost her something she was too honest with herself not to acknowledge. They worked together for 3 hours on the creek bank, restoring the earthworks and setting stones along the edge to reinforce the break. Jedediah worked with the focused competence of a man who understood land and water and what they meant to each other, explaining what he was doing and why in short, clear sentences that never talked down to her. Maggie worked alongside him without any pretense of being anything other than capable, and she could see in the way he watched her, when he thought she wasn't looking, that he noticed. When they were done and the water was running the right way again, they sat on the bank in the cottonwood shade and Jedediah produced a canteen and offered it to her first, which she accepted because she was genuinely thirsty. "You know it was Price," he said. "It was not a question. He came by Monday," Maggie said. "Made me an offer on the land." Jedediah nodded slowly. "He's been after this property for 2 years. Gerald held him off, but Gerald was Gerald. He'd lived here 20 years and everybody knew him. You being new makes Price think he has a better chance." "He does not," Maggie said flatly. Jedediah looked at her, and that almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth again. "I believe you," he said, and his voice had a quality of genuine conviction that she found, against her best efforts, rather reassuring. "But he's going to push harder before he accepts that. He always does." "I dealt with men who push," Maggie said. "It doesn't generally improve my opinion of them." "What does improve your opinion of people?" She glanced at him sideways, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He was looking at the creek, not at her, his forearms resting on his knees and the canteen loose in his hands. "Honesty," she said after a moment, "and following through on what you say you'll do." He nodded, as though this were a reasonable standard, which it was. "I can understand that." They were quiet for a moment. A kingfisher shot over the water in a blur of bright feathers. "Mrs. Hutchins told me you're a rancher," Maggie said. She paused, and then, because she had decided very early in her life that directness saved everyone a great deal of time, she said, "I want you to know, Mr. Barnett, that I don't hold any particular trust for cowboys. I have my reasons for that, and they are good ones. So if you are inclined toward any kind of—" She stopped, feeling faintly foolish, and chose different words. "I would rather we understand each other plainly from the start." Jedediah turned to look at her then, fully and without any deflection, and his dark eyes were direct and entirely without offense. "That is fair," he said. "Let me give you a reason to." The words were simple. They were not charming or overreaching. They were just plain and steady like the man himself, and they landed in a way that Maggie had not expected, not as a promise that felt like a gamble, but as something that felt more like a statement of fact, offered and then left alone for her to do with as she chose. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the creek. "All right," she said. We will see. Over the weeks that followed, Jedediah Barnett made good on those quiet words with a consistency that Maggie found genuinely difficult to ignore, though she applied herself to the task of ignoring it with considerable determination. He stopped by her property every few days, always with a purpose, always with something practical to offer. He brought over an extra length of good fencing wire when she ran short. He told her about the weather patterns specific to this valley, how the storms built from the west in late afternoon during summer, and where the lowest-lying parts of her land were likely to flood if the August rains came heavy. He introduced her to his nearest neighbors, an older couple named the Garfields who had farmed 40 miles east for 15 years, and who were the most reliable people in the county for trading seeds and advice. He never suggested she needed his help, only offered it when it was clearly useful, and he never once tried to tell her how to run her own property. What he did do, which she noticed with careful attention, was always exactly what he said he would do. If he said he would ride the boundary on Wednesday and check the north fence for her while he was doing his own, he appeared on Wednesday and reported back with specifics. If he said the creek level would likely drop in the dry stretch of July and she should fill her water barrels while she still could, she filled them, and the creek level dropped exactly when he said it would. It was this, more than anything, that was the problem. He was not dazzling. He was not performing. He was just reliable in the way that a good solid fence post was reliable. Not impressive to look at, perhaps, but exactly where it was supposed to be and doing exactly what it was supposed to do, day after day without fail. Maggie was aware, with the cool self-knowledge that she had cultivated carefully since the Dale Crocker disaster, that she was in danger of trusting Jedediah Barnett. She was not yet in danger of anything more than that, she told herself firmly, but trust itself was a risk she had decided not to take lightly. She watched him. She paid attention. She looked for the cracks in the performance, because, in her experience, the performance always had cracks if you watched long enough. The cracks she found were not the kind she had been looking for. She noticed that he had a habit of going completely still and quiet when he was thinking through something difficult, the way still water is sometimes the deepest. She noticed that he was uncomfortable with compliments, not from false modesty, but from a genuine unfamiliarity with being praised that suggested a childhood in which it hadn't been offered often. She noticed that he was unexpectedly gentle with animals. She had seen him once spend a quiet 20 minutes calming a young horse that had gotten tangled in wire, talking to it in a low, steady voice without any impatience, with a patience that looked natural rather than forced. She noticed also that he was lonely, though he wore it quietly and without any appeal for sympathy. He had a ranch hand named Pete, who was a cheerful, gap-toothed man of about 40, who did most of his talking for him in social situations, and he had a few acquaintances in town, but Maggie could see that he had few people he truly spoke with. His father had been his closest companion, Mrs. Hutchins had told her one evening, and when his father died 2 years ago, Jedediah had drawn into himself and hadn't fully come back out. One Thursday evening in late July, Maggie was working by lamplight at the table in her cabin. She had managed to make it genuinely livable by now. With curtains she had sewn herself at the windows, and her own plates and cups on the shelf Gerald had built, when there was a knock at the door. She opened it and found Jedediah standing on the step holding his hat in both hands, which she had noticed he did when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "I'm sorry to come by this late," he said. "I was in town this afternoon and I heard something you ought to know." She opened the door wider and stepped back to let him in, and he came in without ceremony and stood near the door with his hat still in his hands, looking at the table rather than at her. "Price has been talking to people," Jedediah said. "He's telling folks that your uncle's deed is disputed, that there was a prior claim on the land that Gerald never properly resolved. It isn't true, as far as I know, but Price has money enough to make false things inconvenient. He talked to Judge Armfield over in Cedar Falls about it." Maggie felt the cold, familiar weight of someone trying to take something from her. What kind of prior claim? He's saying there was a debt Gerald owed a man named Silas Good, and that the land was put up as collateral. I don't know if there's any paperwork behind it, or if Price has just had something manufactured. But you'll want to talk to Pullman tomorrow and get your deed fully recorded with all the right signatures. Maggie was already reaching for her carpetbag. She drew out the deed and looked at it carefully in the lamplight, though she had looked at it a dozen times already and knew every line. Mr. Pullman said he had it in order. He probably does, but you want it formally registered at the county level, not just in Pullman's office. Pullman's a good man, but he's not equipped to fight Harlan Price in a courtroom. He paused. I know a man in Cedar Falls, a lawyer named Holt. He's honest and he's not afraid of Price's money. I could write you a letter of introduction. Why would you do that? Maggie asked. She hadn't meant it to sound like a challenge, but it came out with an edge that she recognized as the sound of old wariness rising. Jedediah looked at her directly. Because your uncle was a good neighbor for 20 years and he never asked for anything he didn't earn. And because Price has been swallowing up this county piece by piece and someone ought to hold the line somewhere. He paused again. And because I told you I'd give you a reason to trust, and I meant it. Maggie looked at him for a long moment in the warm lamplight, the deed in her hands and the night sounds of the Colorado summer coming through the window she'd left open for the air. Write the letter, she said. I'll ride to Cedar Falls on Saturday. He wrote the letter that night at her table while she made coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute most people used out here. And she set a cup beside him without asking, and he wrapped his hands around it and drank it black and didn't say anything about it, but there was something in his expression that suggested the gesture had not gone unnoticed. She rode to Cedar Falls on Saturday. The lawyer named Holt, a sharp-minded man of about 50 with steel-gray sideburns and ink-stained fingers, read the letter of introduction, looked over her deed, listened to what she told him about Price and the alleged prior claim, and then told her very clearly and efficiently exactly what she needed to do. Get this deed recorded at the county clerk's office today, while you're here, he said. I'll send a letter to Judge Armfield. Armfield is a fair man, whatever Price may hope for, and we'll make clear that the title is clean and properly documented. As for this Silas Good business, I'll look into it. If Price has had paperwork manufactured, that's a serious matter and Armfield will not look kindly on it. What do I owe you? Maggie asked. Jedediah Barnett's recommendation is payment enough for the initial consultation, Holt said, and for a moment something in his eyes was warm and almost amused. He doesn't recommend many people, means you're worth the trouble. Maggie rode back to Dusty Creek in the long golden light of late afternoon, and she thought, against her better judgment, about the way Jedediah had sat at her table and written that letter with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything he did. She found herself, riding back, in a state of mind she hadn't occupied in quite some time, open, and not entirely sure how to close herself back up. August settled over Dusty Creek like a warm hand, and Maggie's kitchen garden was growing with the vigorous enthusiasm of well-watered soil that had not been worked in too long and was overdue for the purpose. She had tomatoes and squash and green beans coming in, and she had acquired 6 chickens from the Garfields and a rooster who had opinions about the morning. The cabin was tight and livable, and she had a small income from taking in some sewing for Mrs. Hutchins's neighbor and from selling extra eggs to the general store. She was, by any reasonable measure, managing, more than managing. Jedediah came by on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of August, which was different from his usual weekday visits, and he came without any immediately practical reason, which was also different. He brought a small bundle wrapped in cloth that turned out, when she opened it, to be a jar of honey from a hive his property apparently had among the cottonwoods along his north fence. The bees had a good summer, he said. He was standing on her porch. She had repaired the porch boards and was rather proud of them, and he had his hat in his hands again. "Thank you," Maggie said, holding the jar up to the afternoon light so the honey glowed amber. "Would you like to sit?" He sat, and she brought out 2 cups of the good coffee, and they sat together on the porch in the warm August afternoon with the meadowlarks going and her rooster opining about something in the yard. And they talked, really talked, not about fences or water rights or Harlan Price, but about other things. About Gerald, whom Jedediah had known well and remembered with the specific, detailed fondness of genuine affection. He remembered that Gerald had kept a battered copy of Dickens that he'd read 3 times through, and that he'd always had a story ready for whoever came to visit. About what Maggie had done before coming west, the long years of sewing and laundry in Abilene, the specific kind of endurance that kind of life required. About Jedediah's father, which he came to slowly and carefully, the way you come to something that has tender places in it. "He built the ranch from nothing," Jedediah said, looking out across her yard at the long view of the valley. "Came out here in 1858 with 2 horses and a wagon and just built it. Took 20 years, but he built it. I grew up watching him work, and I understood that work was what a man was made of, what a person was made of." "Do you think that is still true?" Maggie asked. He considered it. "Mostly. But I think," he paused, "I think I maybe didn't learn as well as I should have that work isn't the only thing a person can be made of." There was something in the way he said it that told her it was a thought he had been carrying for a while, possibly a long while, and had not said to anyone before. "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." They sat until the shadows grew long and the evening star appeared above the western ridge. And then Jedediah rose and said he ought to get back, and he took his leave with the usual hat-brim courtesy and rode north in the fading light. Maggie sat on the porch alone for a while after he was gone, holding her empty cup and listening to the evening sounds of the land settling toward night. She felt, with a clarity that was both unexpected and somewhat alarming, that she was looking forward to the next time she would see him. She sat with that feeling and looked at it carefully, the way you look at a flame to figure out whether it is going to stay small and useful or grow into something that gets away from you. She thought about Dale Crocker, the charm that had been performance, the sweetness that had been strategy, the promises that had been nothing but air. She thought about the difference between that and the way Jedediah Barnett spoke, which was like reading a document written by someone who understood that every word has weight. She did not trust cowboys. She had said so plainly and for good reason. But she was beginning, carefully and with her eyes wide open, to trust Jedediah Barnett. And the distinction, she was realizing, was not as contradictory as she had assumed. September arrived, and with it Harlan Price's next move. She came home from town one morning to find that the gate in her south fence had been left open and 20 of Price's cattle had wandered through and helped themselves liberally to her kitchen garden. The damage was considerable. 3 weeks of her most productive plants had been trampled and eaten, and the garden bed nearest the gate was a churned ruin. Maggie stood in the middle of it for a long time without speaking. Her hands were trembling, but not from grief, from a very specific and focused rage that she had learned to respect and control rather than express in ways that would not serve her. She went inside. She got her notebook. She documented the damage in careful, specific terms, with measurements and estimates. She got the name of 2 neighbors who had seen the cattle on her property from the road. Then she rode to town and filed a formal complaint with Sheriff Tate, who listened with an expression of genuine concern mixed with the particular wariness of a man who knows exactly who he's dealing with. "I'll go talk to Price," he said. "He'll pay for the damage." "I also want it on record," Maggie said, formally, "that this happened." "Yes, ma'am," Tate said, and something in his voice suggested he respected her more for asking for it that way than if she had simply taken the compensation and let it go. She was riding back to her property when she met Jedediah on the road. He took one look at her face and pulled up his horse alongside hers. "What happened?" she told him. His expression during the telling was very still, the way a lake goes still before a storm, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He's escalating," Jedediah said. "I know. You need to let Holt know in Cedar Falls." "This is exactly the kind of pattern that matters in a legal proceeding." "I know that too," Maggie said. "I have already written up the documentation. I'll send it tomorrow." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to fully read. Respect was clearly in it, and something warmer than respect, and something that looked like the slight bewilderment of a man who has spent a long time being the most capable person in his immediate vicinity, and is not entirely sure what to do about meeting someone who is equally so. "Is there anything I can help with?" he asked. "The garden will need to be recleared and replanted where I can still plant this fall," she said. "But that I can manage. What I need more than help with the garden is—" She stopped. "What?" "A witness," she said. "Someone Price knows and respects who has been present enough on this property to testify honestly about what has been happening if this goes before a judge." Jedediah was quiet for a moment. "I've seen the creek damage and the fence breaks," he said, "and I know the land. I'll testify to anything I've witnessed." He paused. "And I'll make sure I witness more." The last sentence came out with a quiet deliberateness that had nothing evasive about it, and Maggie felt the meaning of it settle in her chest like warmth. "Thank you," she said. They rode back to her property together, and he helped her clear the garden beds while the afternoon light moved across the valley, working in the easy companionable rhythm that they had fallen into over the months of working alongside each other. A rhythm that required no negotiation and very little speech, as if they had spent much longer together than they actually had. At one point Jedediah said, without looking up from the row he was clearing, "You are one of the most self-reliant people I have ever met." Maggie sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both," he said, and then after a beat, "and a small concern." She raised an eyebrow. "A concern?" He looked up then, and his expression was careful and honest and a little unguarded in a way she was beginning to recognize as the expression of a man who is deciding to say the true thing. "Self-reliance is a virtue out here," he said. "I know that, I believe it. But sometimes I think—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider, then went on. "Sometimes I think the people who have most needed to rely on themselves become so good at it that they don't allow for the possibility that some things might be better with someone alongside them." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was coming amber and long across the garden, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek a bird was calling in the growing dusk. "Are you speaking about me?" she asked. "Or about yourself?" The almost smile appeared, and this time it went further than almost. It became briefly and fully a real smile, and it changed his face considerably, made it younger and open in a way that she suspected not many people got to see. "Both," he said, the same word he had used before. And she found herself smiling too. That evening, they ate supper together at her table, for the first time beans and corn bread, and the last of the summer tomatoes, and the honey he had brought on the porch that had been sitting in her cupboard waiting for an occasion. And they talked until the stars were fully out, and the coyotes had started their distant conversation across the dark valley. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to read his father's face the way you learn to read weather signs, about a winter when he was 15 when the ranch nearly failed, and his father didn't sleep for 3 days trying to solve it. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, and about the years after that when she had run most of the household for her father, who was a decent man but not a practical one, and about how she had left at 19 for Abilene because it had been the only way to make a different kind of life. She did not tell him about Dale Crocker, not that night, but she was aware that she was getting closer to the point where she might. October came with its shorter days and the first cold edges of mountain autumn, and the aspen groves on the ridges turned a gold so brilliant it seemed to generate its own light. Maggie's root vegetables came in well, and she had her cellar stocked for winter. The legal matter with Price had progressed. Holt had sent letters. Armfield had inquired into the alleged prior claim, and the claim had dissolved under inquiry because it turned out the paperwork Price had presented had very subtle but unmistakable inconsistencies that a careful examination made clear were fabrications. Price had not been charged with anything, men like Price rarely were, which was its own kind of injustice, and Maggie understood that even as she accepted it, but his claim was dismissed entirely, and the judge had written a letter affirming Maggie's deed as clean and unencumbered, which Holt had made sure was filed with every relevant office in the county. Price, for the moment, had gone quiet. She didn't believe it was permanent, but she took the breathing room for what it was. On a Saturday afternoon in the middle of October, Jedediah asked her if she wanted to ride up to the ridge above the valley to see the aspens. For pleasure. She asked because most of their rides together had been practical ones. For pleasure, he said, as though he was aware that this was a departure and didn't mind her noticing it. She said yes. They rode up through the sage and the pine to the ridge, and the aspens were exactly as extraordinary as the season had been promising, a sweep of trembling gold that covered the slope so completely and so brilliantly that for a moment neither of them spoke, because the view had the quality of something that deserves a moment's silence. They had ridden past the point of needing to justify being in each other's company. The town knew they spent time together, and Mrs. Hutchins had said nothing about it except to look pleased in the particular way of a woman whose instincts about people tend to be right and who knows it. Maggie had stopped analyzing each encounter for what it might mean or might not mean, and had allowed herself to simply be present in them, which was harder than it sounded for a person who had built careful walls around her inner life and had very good reasons for each brick. They sat their horses side by side at the top of the ridge, looking out over the gold-drenched slope and the wide valley below, where the distant rooftops of Dusty Creek were just visible in the afternoon light. "I want to tell you something," Maggie said without looking at him. "All right," he said quietly and gave her the space to find her way to it. She told him about Dale Crocker. She told him plainly and without self-pity, the way she told most important things. The courtship, the promises, the engagement, the abandonment, the wreck of her reputation in a town where reputation was the only currency women were allowed to trade in. She told him about deciding to leave, about the specific loneliness of being a woman who has been wronged, and who is also expected to absorb the social consequences of someone else's dishonesty. Jedediah listened without interrupting, without the visible discomfort that some people displayed when hearing difficult things, which sometimes came from not knowing what to do with other people's pain, and sometimes from not wanting to look at it too closely. His discomfort, when she finished and the silence came, was clearly not from avoidance but from a very specific feeling that he seemed to be managing with care. "He was a coward," Jedediah said. His voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it that was not directed at her. "What he did, the kind of man who does that, is a coward who doesn't deserve the name of the thing he is. And the people who blamed you for it instead of him were wrong, and they know it, or they should." Maggie looked at him. His jaw was set and his eyes were on the middle distance of the valley, and she could see that the feeling he was managing was old-fashioned anger on her behalf, not at her, and it was entirely genuine. "That is why I said what I said to you that first day," she said. "About cowboys." "I know," he said, "and I meant what I said back." "I know you did," Maggie said, and the weight in her voice came from the fact that this was the first time she had fully admitted it, to herself as much as to him. He looked at her then, and the gold light of the aspens was on both their faces, and she saw in his eyes something that she recognized because she felt it herself, careful and certain all at once, the way something feels when you have tested it enough times to believe it and you're not willing to pretend otherwise anymore. "Maggie," he said. He rarely used her first name, and when he did it had a particular quality to it, something deliberate. "Yes," she said. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I'm not going to make promises I don't mean. I'm not going to ride away." He paused. "I know that words are easy and that you have heard words before, so I'm not asking you to believe me on words. I'm asking you to keep watching, and I'll keep showing you." She looked at him for a long, full moment in the aspen light, with the cold mountain air coming off the ridge and the valley spread below them, and the whole extraordinary golden afternoon holding still around them as if it understood this was a moment worth holding. "I have been watching," she said, "for months. I know. And I believe you," she said. She had not planned to say it so plainly, but there it was, and she found, saying it, that it did not feel like a risk in the way she had expected. It felt like something she had already decided and was only now admitting out loud. Jedediah reached across the space between their horses and, slowly and with every opportunity for her to move away, took her hand. His hand was large and rough with work and warm, and it closed around hers with a steadiness that felt, simply, like the truth. They rode back down the ridge in the golden afternoon, and it was not the same as riding up had been, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. November arrived with cold mornings and blue skies, and the particular beauty of the Colorado high country moving toward winter with no apology for how demanding it was going to be. Maggie spent her days preparing the property for the cold months, banking the cabin walls with extra insulation, making sure the root cellar was well sealed, cutting and stacking wood. Jedediah came and helped with the wood, arriving with his own axe and spending a long Saturday splitting logs while Pete hauled and stacked them, and made cheerful conversation at Maggie, who responded with good humor and the occasional dry remark that made Pete laugh with genuine delight. "She's funny," Pete confided to Jedediah, not particularly quietly, while Maggie was inside making lunch. "I wasn't sure she'd be funny. She seemed serious." "She is serious," Jedediah said, "and funny, she's both." Pete grinned the gap-toothed grin. "You like her awful lot, don't you?" Jedediah looked at Pete with the expression of a man who has long ago decided that Pete is not worth getting flustered by. "Stack the wood, Pete." Pete stacked the wood, still grinning. Over lunch at Maggie's table, she made a pot of vegetable soup and fresh bread, because she had discovered early that she enjoyed cooking for more than one person, and had not had occasion to do it often enough. Pete ate 3 bowls of soup, and told stories about the early years of the ranch, with the enthusiastic indiscretion of a man who has never quite grasped that discretion is a quality some people value. Jedediah mostly listened and occasionally corrected a detail, and Maggie learned more about Jedediah Barnett from 2 hours with Pete than from any amount of careful observation, which was both illuminating and somewhat amusing. She learned that he had once ridden through a blizzard to find a lost calf for a neighbor who couldn't afford to lose it, that he gave Pete a fair wage and Christmas money when times allowed, that he had turned down Harlan Price's offer to work for him 4 years ago, which had apparently marked the beginning of a cold relationship between them, that he read when he could, kept a small collection of books on a shelf his father had built, and on winter evenings would sometimes read aloud to Pete and the 2 other hands, which Pete described with touching unself-consciousness as one of his favorite things about working there. He read aloud on winter evenings. Maggie sat with that image and found it settled comfortably in her mind, alongside everything else she knew about him. One afternoon in late November, when the first real snow of the season had dusted the ridges white and was threatening to come down into the valley, Jedediah came by and did not come with any practical purpose at all. He simply came and sat on her porch in his heavy coat, and she brought out coffee and sat beside him, and they watched the snow move down the ridge in a gray curtain, advancing across the valley toward them in that slow and certain way that weather moves out here, as if it has all the time in the world. "I have been thinking," Jedediah said. "About what?" He looked at the approaching snow and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had been building for a while. "About what I want," he said. "And what I'm going to do about it." Maggie looked at him. The snow was close now. She could smell the cold sharpness of it, and the first flakes were beginning to drift down around the porch. "What do you want?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and his face was open and clear in the way she had come to understand was the expression he wore when he was being entirely, vulnerably honest. "You," he said simply, "and a life that is not as quiet as the one I've been living. I want to ask you something, and I don't want you to feel any pressure in either direction, because I mean it when I say I want you to have every choice your own." Maggie's heart was doing something she chose not to describe to herself in overly dramatic terms, but it was doing something definite and unmistakable. "Ask," she said. "Would you be willing to let me court you?" he said, "formally and properly. I know that means something specific out here, and I'm not asking it lightly. I'm asking it because I want to do this right, and I want you to know I'm serious." The snow was coming down around them now, soft and steady, landing on the porch railing and the yard and the bare branches of the apple tree Gerald had planted years ago near the cabin wall. It was a beautiful thing, the snow, the way it covered everything in quiet. "Jedediah," she said. "Yes, you have been courting me," she said, "for 4 months. You are the only person who hasn't noticed." The smile came, full and unguarded and warm, and it transformed his face the way the sun transforms a landscape. Suddenly everything looked different, and the difference was that it looked like itself, finally, without the reserve that usually overlaid it. "Then I suppose I should make it official," he said. "I suppose you should," she agreed. He took her hand, the same way he had on the ridge, steady and warm, and they sat together in the snow while it came down around them and covered the world in white. And Maggie thought about what she had said that first afternoon by the creek, that she did not trust cowboys, and about what he had said back, and about the fact that in the months since then he had done exactly what he promised, without fanfare and without expecting anything in return, just steadily and honestly and every single day. Until she had found herself trusting him not because she had decided to, but because he had simply made it the truth. December was cold and bright and full of the particular intimacy of a Colorado winter, which forces people indoors and toward each other by the simple logic of warmth. Jedediah came to supper twice a week, and Maggie went to the ranch twice a week, and on the weekends they went to church together, which caused a significant amount of pleased commentary from Mrs. Hutchins and the congregation, and which neither of them particularly minded. At the ranch she met his small herd well-kept animals, all of them, with the healthy look of cattle that have been ranched with care rather than run for maximum profit. She walked the property with him on clear days, learning its particular geography the way she knew her own land's geography, and she told him about her plans for the spring planting, and he listened with the quality of attention that felt like being genuinely seen. On Christmas Day, Mrs. Hutchins hosted a dinner for what she described as her strays, which included Maggie and Jedediah and Pete and old Mr. Garfield and his wife, and the young schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy who had arrived in October and had not yet made many friends. It was a long and noisy and warm dinner with a turkey and 4 kinds of pie, and Jedediah, who was more comfortable with small groups than large ones, sat beside Maggie and was quieter than most people at the table but not uncomfortable. And at one point during an argument about something Mrs. Hutchins and Mrs. Garfield were debating, he leaned slightly toward Maggie and murmured a very quiet and very dry comment that made her press her lips together to keep from laughing at the wrong moment, which was one of the best feelings she had experienced in quite some time. After dinner, when the sky had gone dark and the stars were brilliant and hard with cold above the town, Jedediah and Maggie walked back toward her boarding room. She was still keeping the room at Mrs. Hutchins's on the nights she didn't stay at the ranch, for propriety's sake, and because she had genuinely grown fond of Mrs. Hutchins. And he stopped on the street in front of the church and turned to her. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out something small, which he held between his fingers in the starlight. It was a ring, plain gold, simple and good, with a small turquoise stone set flush with the band. Turquoise, she knew, was traded by the native peoples of this region and had been used by them in their jewelry and ornamentation for centuries beyond counting, and many people in the territory wore it, and she had admired it in the market at Cedar Falls. "I am not a man who is good at speeches," Jedediah said. I have a few good sentences in me at the right moments, but I don't have the kind of words that fill up a whole speech. So I'm going to ask you simply." He looked at her with the directness that was the thing about him she had trusted first, before she had trusted anything else. "Maggie Lawson, will you marry me?" The cold air was very clear, and the stars were very bright, and the church behind them was a dark shape against the sky, and the whole quiet town of Dusty Creek lay around them in its winter stillness. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the starlight, the plain gold and the blue-green turquoise, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression of such plain and uncomplicated happiness that it made her chest ache in the best possible way. He kissed her then, for the first time, there on the cold street under the Colorado stars, and it was not a complicated kiss. It was honest and warm and certain, the way he was, and it lasted exactly as long as it should and no longer, and when they stepped back there was a moment of looking at each other in which everything that had been building for months was acknowledged and complete. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am going to be as good a husband as I know how to be, and that I'll keep learning the parts I don't know yet." "So will I," she said. "I haven't been particularly good at letting people in." "You've been getting better at it," he said, and there was no criticism in it, only observation, the same careful observation he had always given her. "You have been patient," she said. "You are worth being patient for," he said, and she believed him. They were married in April, when the valley was coming back to life, and the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first pale green leaves. The ceremony was in the church with the repaired steeple. One of the things that had happened over the winter was that a collective effort by several of the town's men had finally straightened and secured the steeple, which Maggie had always felt was an appropriate metaphor for something, though she had never fully worked out for what. Mrs. Hutchins stood up with Maggie, because she had become, over the months, genuinely dear to her. Pete stood up with Jedediah, wearing a suit that was slightly too large and a tie he had clearly borrowed, with an expression of enormous pride that made Maggie's heart completely full. Holt, the lawyer from Cedar Falls, came to the wedding, which surprised her. He had sent a letter saying he would come, and he had, and he shook Jedediah's hand with the warmth of a man who has done something right by helping connect two people who deserve to be connected. The matter of Harlan Price had not entirely resolved itself in the pleasant way Maggie would have preferred. He was still in the county, and still large, and still the kind of man who ate up the land and the lives of smaller people when he could. But his claim on Maggie's property was dead and documented, and the neighbors who had watched him for years were watching him more carefully now, and Holt had been quietly building a relationship with the county's legal structures that made Price's particular strategies more difficult to execute. It was not justice the way justice ought to look, complete and satisfying, but it was the kind of ongoing, incremental accountability that the real world offered when the ideal was not available, and Maggie accepted it with the practical realism she applied to most things. Price left her alone. That was enough for now. On the night of their wedding, the town of Dusty Creek put on a celebration that lasted until well past midnight, with fiddle music and dancing in the street in front of the saloon, and a great quantity of Mrs. Hutchins's pie and considerable noise from Pete, who had opinions about celebrating and shared all of them at considerable volume. Maggie and Jedediah danced in the street in the warm April night, and she discovered that he danced with the same quality he brought to everything, not flashy, but solid, with a clear sense of where he was going and an easy lead that made her want to follow. "I used to think I wasn't going to have this," Maggie said, at some point in the evening when the music had slowed and they were moving together on the street with the lights of the saloon warm around them. "Have what?" he asked. "This," she said. "Any of it." "A place that was mine. Someone who," she stopped, finding the shape of it. "Someone who sees me as I am and wants that specifically. Not an idea of me, just me." Jedediah was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the steadiness of him under her hands, the warm solidity of him. "I see you," he said. I have been seeing you since you stood on that creek bank with your notebook and told me you'd already noted the fence." She laughed quietly. "That was not a particularly romantic moment." "It was to me," he said, and he meant it. They moved to the ranch in May, though Maggie kept her property. She was keeping it, working it, building it slowly into something productive, and she would not be giving it up. This, Jedediah had not only accepted but encouraged. He helped her lay out a proper kitchen garden on the east-facing slope of her land, 3 times the size of the one Price's cattle had destroyed, with good deep beds and a simple irrigation channel from the creek. He built her a proper chicken coop, a real one, with a secure wire run and a nesting box, and she expanded her flock to 12 birds. The ranch and the smaller property worked in a kind of complementary way, each strengthening the other, the way it tended to go when two people with capable minds and a shared direction pooled their resources without one of them having to disappear into the other. That summer, working side by side on both properties through the long Colorado days, Maggie understood something she had not fully understood before about the nature of the trust she had given Jedediah. It was not the trust of someone who has stopped being careful. She was still careful. She would always be careful. It was part of how she was made. But she had discovered that careful and trusting were not, as she had previously believed, opposites, that you could have both. That real trust, the kind built from evidence and consistency, from someone showing up and following through and being honest about what they were, and what they weren't, was not a risk in the way that blind faith was a risk. It was something you earned the right to feel if you paid attention. She had paid attention, and here she was. The first autumn of their marriage was a particularly fine season. The harvest came in well, the cattle were fat, and Jedediah sold his beef at a good price at the fall market, enough to reinvest in both the ranch and improvements to Maggie's property. They had repaired and expanded the cabin on her land to the point where it could serve as a proper working outbuilding, with a proper root cellar and a real stone-floored dairy, where she kept the butter and cheese she'd begun producing from the 2 cows Jedediah had allowed her to bring over from the ranch herd. On evenings in the ranch house, Jedediah read aloud. She had been looking forward to this since Pete had described it at lunch back in November, and it was exactly what she had imagined. He had a good reading voice, measured and clear, and he chose books thoughtfully. They read their way through Dickens, the same author Gerald had loved, and through Washington Irving and Fenimore Cooper, and one evening Maggie read aloud to him from a book of poetry she had brought west from Abilene and rarely taken out, and his expression while he listened was one she kept privately in her heart like a pressed flower. In December, a year after he had proposed to her on the street in front of the church, Maggie told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast on a Thursday morning, setting a cup of coffee in front of him, and then sitting down across the table and saying, simply and directly, the way she said most important things, "We're going to have a baby." Jedediah looked up from the cup and looked at her, and for a moment his face did the thing it rarely did, which was show everything at once, surprise and joy and something deep and slightly unsteady, the way solid ground feels for just a moment after a tremor, before settling back into itself better than before. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands, very carefully, the way you hold something you understand is precious, and he looked at her for a long moment with dark eyes that were entirely transparent. "Are you well?" he asked first, because this was the first thing he thought to ask, which told her something about him she had not needed to be told but was glad to be reminded of. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead and then sat down beside her instead of across from her and held her hand on the table, and they were quiet together for a while in the kitchen, with the winter light coming through the window and the smell of the coffee and the snow outside on the ridges, and the whole long life of the thing they had built together stretching out ahead of them, new and possible. The baby arrived in August, when the valley was at its most lush, and the creek ran full and cold from the summer rains. It was a boy, born after a long labor with Mrs. Hutchins present because she had delivered more babies than she could count, and nobody in Dusty Creek went through a difficult moment without her if they could help it. He was a solid, healthy boy who announced his arrival with a voice of considerable authority, and who had, from his first hour, his father's particular stillness between his louder moments. A quality of attention, of watchfulness, that made Maggie think he was going to spend his life paying close attention to things, which she considered an excellent way to live. They named him Gerald after her uncle, and Jedediah did not hesitate when she suggested it, did not suggest any other name, only said, "Gerald Barnett." That's a good name, with the simple certainty of a man who understood exactly why it was the right choice. Gerald was a happy baby, and then a curious toddler, and then a determined small boy who inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience in proportions that sometimes seemed designed by the universe specifically to balance each other out. He was 3 years old when his sister arrived, a girl they named Clara, after Mrs. Hutchins, who wept with undisguised happiness, and then immediately stopped weeping and became very brisk and practical about the whole thing, because this was how she handled strong emotions. The years settled in around them with the comfortable permanence of things that are supposed to last. Jedediah expanded the ranch carefully and thoughtfully, never faster than the land could support, never with more risk than the year's circumstances warranted. He was a good cattleman, not in the flashy, hard-driving way of men who pushed their herds too fast and ran their land too hard, but in the quiet, sustainable way of a man who understood that the land was not his to use up but his to steward. His cattle were known in the county for their quality, and his prices reflected it. Maggie's property, always her property in her name, as she had determined from the beginning, became a productive and diversified small farm. The kitchen garden alone, in a good year, produced more than they needed, and she sold the excess to the general store and to several of the town's families. The chickens expanded into a genuine small flock. The dairy operation grew. She took on a girl from town, a capable 15-year-old named Ruth, to help with the washing and the garden work during the heavy seasons, and she paid her fairly and taught her things Ruth found useful, which felt like the right kind of exchange. She still sewed. She could not entirely stop. In the evenings by the lamp she sewed, sometimes necessary things, clothes for Gerald and Clara and Jedediah, repairs to the household linens, and sometimes things just for the pleasure of the work, fine stitching that she gave as gifts or simply kept because they were beautiful and she had made them. Harlan Price ultimately overreached. It came 3 years after Maggie's marriage, when he attempted to dam a creek that served as water source for 4 neighboring properties, and was met with a collective legal challenge that Holt had been preparing the groundwork for patiently and for some time. The case went to the circuit court and Price lost, decisively and publicly, and the terms of the judgment included a requirement that he restore the water access and a formal reprimand that became part of the county's legal record. It was not everything that justice required of a man like Price, but it was public and it was permanent, and it changed the way the county looked at him, and the properties he had been pushing on stopped being pushed. People held their lines. Maggie received the news of the judgment on a Tuesday and sat with it quietly for a while before telling Jedediah that evening. He listened and nodded and said, "Good." Just the one word with the weight of a great deal of patience behind it. "It's not enough," she said, "not for everything he's done." "No," he agreed, "it's not, but it's something, and it'll hold." She looked at him across the supper table with Gerald's high chair between them and Clara in the cradle by the fire and the comfortable disorder of a lived-in house all around them. "You knew this would take time," she said, "when I was ready to fight everything at once, right at the beginning." "You were right to fight," he said. "The time was just the cost of doing it in a way that would stick." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, which was the gesture of their years together, now him taking her hand, her taking his, The small, constant acknowledgement that the other person was there. On a morning in the spring of their 5th year of marriage, Maggie rode out early to her property. She still rode it alone often, still walked the fence lines and the creek bank and the garden beds with her notebook, still needed the particular solitude of her own land under her own feet, and she stood at the water's edge in the cottonwood shade and looked at the creek running clear and cold over its stones. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek 7 years ago with a deed in her carpetbag and a wall around her heart, and a very specific and entirely justified conviction that cowboys were not to be trusted. She thought about what that woman would think, standing here now on this ground she had kept and worked and made into something real, with 2 children and a husband who had never once, in 5 years of marriage, given her cause to doubt him. She thought about what it cost to trust, and what it gave back. The creek was the same creek it had always been, cold and clear and running south along the edge of her property with the same indifferent constancy. The cottonwoods were larger than they had been 7 years ago. The garden beds she could see from here were full of last year's turned earth, ready for spring planting, rich with the years of working and enriching she had given the soil. She heard hooves behind her and turned. Jedediah rode up on the buckskin, a different buckskin from the one he'd had when they met, a younger horse, but he always seemed to go back to buckskins. She had noticed, the way some people always came back to the same color, and he swung down and ground-hitched the horse and came to stand beside her at the creek. "Pete told me you'd come out early," he said. "I thought I'd bring your coffee before it got cold." He held out a tin cup, wrapped in a cloth to keep the heat in and her hands from burning. She took it with both hands and looked at him. He was 40 now, not very different from the 28-year-old who had ridden up on this same bank that first summer morning, a little more weathered, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but the same quality of attention in his face, the same steadiness. "I was thinking about that first day," she said. "On the creek bank." "Yes." He was quiet, looking at the water. "What were you thinking?" "That I told you I didn't trust cowboys," she said. "And you said that was fair and that you'd give me a reason to." She looked at him. "You have given me about 1,000 reasons since then." He turned to look at her, and the full, warm smile was there, not the restrained, almost smile of those first months, but the one she had unlocked, the one that changed his whole face, the one that was entirely hers. "I intend to give you 1,000 more," he said. She lifted herself up and kissed him, there by the creek in the spring morning, with the cottonwoods just leafing out above them and the meadowlarks starting their day and the cold, clear creek running south and the whole wide Colorado sky overhead in its extravagant blue. When she stepped back, he was still smiling, and she was too. "We should get back," she said. "Gerald will be awake and hungry and loud about both." "He gets that from his mother," Jedediah said. "He gets the loud from his father's silence," Maggie said. "All those years of quiet stored up, and now he is spending it on your behalf." Jedediah laughed, a genuine, full laugh that she loved with a specific and particular love, the way you love the things about a person that are most completely themselves, and they walked back up the creek bank together toward the horses. The summer their son Gerald turned 5, and their daughter Clara turned 2, Maggie discovered she was expecting again. She told Jedediah in the same way she had told him the first time, directly, over coffee, on a Thursday morning, and he responded in the same way he had the first time, with the immediate question of whether she was well, followed by a stillness that was entirely happiness. Their second son was born in February, arriving in a snowstorm with a punctuality that Pete said showed excellent character. They named him James, which had been Jedediah's father's name, and Jedediah held the baby for the first time with the particular combination of careful strength and barely contained emotion that big, quiet men sometimes display in the presence of new life, as though everything in them that doesn't have a regular outlet has found one. "Hello, James," he said softly, in the low, steady voice he used with animals he was trying to calm, not because babies needed calming, Maggie thought, but because it was the voice he used when he was being completely sincere and entirely unguarded. "Welcome." Clara, who was 2.5 and had opinions about most things, climbed up on the chair beside her father and peered at the baby with the expression of someone doing a thorough assessment. "He's little," she announced. "You were little once," Jedediah told her. Clara considered this and appeared to find it unlikely. Gerald, who was 5 and deeply impressed by the arrival of another brother, because brothers were more interesting to him than sisters by current estimate, though this would change and change back several times over the years, asked immediately whether James would be old enough to ride by summer. Jedediah explained the timeline of infant development with admirable patience while holding the baby, and while Maggie rested and watched them all and felt the particular fullness of the moment, a feeling she had learned, over the years, not to be afraid of. The fullness was real. It was allowed to be real. She had worked for it and she had trusted for it, and she had earned the right to feel it completely. Mrs. Hutchins lived another 12 years after Maggie and Jedediah's marriage, and she was a fixture of their family's life for every one of those years. She ate Sunday dinner with them most weeks and had an opinion on every child-rearing decision, and shared it freely, and was right often enough that they had both learned to listen even when they initially disagreed. When she died at the age of 72, she died in her own house with Maggie sitting beside her, and the funeral was attended by most of the town, which said everything that needed to be said about the kind of person she had been. Pete stayed on at the ranch for the rest of his working life, and he was as much a part of the family as any person can be who is not technically family. He taught Gerald to ride properly at the age of 6, and Gerald later said that Pete's patient teaching was the reason he became the horseman he did. When Pete's joints got too stiff for heavy ranch work, he managed the smaller tasks and the record-keeping with cheerful competence, and he lived in the bunkhouse at the ranch until he was old and gray and had more stories than there were evenings to tell them in. The land that had been Gerald Lawson's became, over the years, one of the most productive small farms in the county. Maggie diversified it carefully over time, added an orchard, apple and pear trees along the south slope above the creek, built a proper smokehouse for curing meat, and established a small but reliable commercial operation in preserved fruits and vegetables that found a steady market in Cedar Falls and in the mining camps further west, where fresh produce was rare and expensive, and people would pay well for it. She never stopped walking the fence lines and the creek bank. She never stopped carrying the small leather-bound notebook. She added new volumes as the old ones filled, and she kept them all on a shelf in the ranch house, a row of filled notebooks that represented, in compressed and practical form, 20 years of paying close attention to a piece of ground and what it needed. When their daughter Clara was 18 and had decided she wanted to study, there were women's colleges in the East by then, and Clara was going to go to one, and nobody in the family had the slightest doubt that she would do exactly what she set her mind to. She sat at the kitchen table with Maggie one evening and asked her mother something she had been working up to for several years. "Were you afraid?" Clara asked. "When you came out here, when you decided to trust Father?" Maggie looked at her daughter, who had her own green eyes and Jedediah's dark hair and a sharpness about her that was entirely her own. "Yes," she said honestly, "both times. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway," Maggie said. "Fear is a reasonable response to things that could hurt you. It tells you to pay attention, but you don't have to let it make the decisions." Clara sat with this for a moment. "How did you know Father was different?" "From the man before. I watched," Maggie said. "I paid attention for a very long time, and he was exactly what he appeared to be every single time I checked." She paused. "That is the thing about trustworthy people. They are consistent. They do not require you to look away." Clara nodded slowly, and Maggie could see in her daughter's expression the particular look of someone filing a piece of information away in a place they intend to keep it. Jedediah was 53 when a hard winter put a strain on the ranch that required careful management, and he managed it with the same unhurried competence he had always brought to difficulty, measuring the feed supplies, making the necessary decisions about herd size without sentiment but with clear practical logic, coming through the far side of the winter with the ranch sound and Gerald and James, both grown and working the ranch now. Having learned something important about how to navigate adversity without panic. He was sitting on the porch of the ranch house on the first warm evening of that following spring, watching the valley come back to color after the long white months, when Maggie came out with the coffee and sat beside him, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not empty silence but full silence, the kind that two people can only share after years of learning each other's particular language. "Do you remember," he said, "when you told me you didn't trust cowboys?" "I remember exactly," she said. "Do you still think you were right?" She considered it with the seriousness the question deserved, looking out over the valley in the early spring evening, at the creek glinting in the distance and the first green haze on the ridges where the aspen were beginning to bud. "I was right that I had good reason," she said. "I was right to be careful. I was right not to give trust away without evidence." She looked at him. "I was right about all of that. I was only wrong to think that meant trusting was itself the mistake." He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture as always, steady and warm. "I love you," he said. He did not say it constantly. He said it when he meant it, which was always, and the selectivity of his saying it made each instance feel like new coin. "I love you," she said back, with the fullness of 25 years of meaning it. The valley settled into its spring evening around them. The creek murmured at its banks. Somewhere on the far ridge a coyote called once and went quiet. The light went gold and then rose and then deep blue, and the first stars appeared above the eastern mountains, and the two of them sat together on the porch of the house they had built their life in, holding hands in the cooling air, with the full and finished shape of the life they had made together all around them. Gerald would come for Sunday supper with his wife, a practical and good-humored woman from the next valley, whom he had met at the county fair, and who had made him work considerably harder for her trust than most women would have, which Maggie considered to be a point in her very high favor. James was in town working with Holt's nephew at the law office, having discovered at the age of 16 that the law was the thing that interested him most, and pursuing it with the focused determination of a person who knows his own mind. Clara wrote letters from the East, long letters full of ideas and arguments, and the specific delight of someone discovering that the world contains more and more to learn the further you go into it. It was a good life. It was the specific good life that comes not from luck or ease, but from work and honesty, and the willingness to look at fear and walk through it anyway, toward the thing on the other side that is worth having. Maggie Lawson, Maggie Barnett now, and both names felt right to her in different ways. The first the name she had brought to this land, and the second the name she had chosen with full knowledge and free, sat on the porch in the spring evening, and felt the rightness of it settle through her the way warmth settles into cold hands slowly, thoroughly, all the way to the center. She had come to Colorado with a deed and a broken heart, and the absolute conviction that she was done with cowboys. And she had been right to be careful, and right to watch, and right to wait until the watching and the waiting were done, and the evidence was in, and the verdict was clear and certain and permanent. And the verdict was this, that Jedediah Barnett was exactly what he had said he would be, from the first afternoon by the creek to this evening on the porch and every single day between them. That he had given her not one reason to trust him but 1,000, and was still giving them, and would keep giving them for as long as they were both alive to give and to receive. The stars brightened overhead, cold and brilliant, the same stars that had shone down on the night he proposed to her in the street in front of the church with the snowflakes beginning to fall. "We should go in," she said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," he said, not moving. She stayed in the minute with him, looking at the stars, holding his hand in the spring cold, and found that she did not want to move either. Some things are worth sitting with a little longer. And this, all of this, the whole of it was one of them.